Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by a special guest, my own flesh and blood, my dear brother Sean Dempsey. And we are going to discuss issues of great import, which relate to whatever we want to cover in this conversation. But I believe we're going to get into the issue of navigating the postmodern terrain and moving beyond it, and as it relates to certain issues.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, set us up.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me back, Brendan. It's good to be back on the show.
Yes.
I believe you aired the episode I was on last time.
It was the biggest hit, and it propelled my podcast into new heights.
Well, I had a lot of fun, and it's good to be here discussing matters of great import.
Great import. So one of the things we talked about as a framing mechanism for this was to get into the I guess you just call it sort of the postmodern background context for well, then that was sort of the question, because there's I think one of the ways into this would be thinking about the way that the postmodern paradigm creates a certain kind of relativistic, unmoored, sort of what have you approach to reality, which then begins to impinge in a major way on all sorts of very practical, pragmatic levels in terms of economic concerns and cultural concerns, philosophical concerns. So I think we were going to sort of consider starting out just sort of thinking about that to begin with, and then navigating.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Well, that sounds great. No, I think that's a great way of teeing it up. I maybe use less ambitious terminology. I would just say my experience has been that the postmodern, let's just say framework, well, let's just say postmodern cultural phenomenon has unmasked the fact that it's almost my reality is better or greater or different from your reality, and it becomes this subjective convenience to basically make up your own truths and your own view of the world. And I find that may be all well and good when it comes to some areas of interest, or some interests of peripheral vision in regards to your sanity. But I feel like when it comes to matters of empiricism, science, and you mentioned economics, there is no subjectivity.
Well, so what's an example of something that you've encountered directly that you see this operating in? Is there because a lot of people talk about postmodern relativism, postmodern this and that, and then it's often sort of this amorphous, nebulous boogeyman. So
Sure.
What do you name something specific?
Well, let's start with the fun stuff, and I guess we can backdrop into some maybe more important matters. But I think the matter of just in culture, and this may be very antiquated topic when it comes to things that you talked about on your podcast or elsewhere, but just in the nature of film and literature, let's just say the matters of right and wrong, good and bad, have become nebulous quagmires just in the last 30 years, 20 years of television and TV, where you kind of basically are caught in this it's almost like cliche now to have a good guy or a bad guy. You need to have this morally diverse, ambiguous character. Even the villains are half good and the heroes are half bad, and unless that impregnates every element of modern media, you almost have a trite piece of work. At least that's been my experience. And let's give you an example. So let's just pick one out of the hat. I mean, again, there's thousands of examples, but I mean, what comes to mind, because I'm a Star Wars nerd, is the last one of the last movies that I remember watching. I know there's been a lot of movies since then, but The Last Jedi, it was called, which was the seventh. I think it was the seventh installment, or the reboot. And you found that the heroes that I've grown up with, the rebels, in that particular movie you find are just as culpable as the villains or as the Empire, because they're basically buying the weaponry from the same source. And so
It's funny. I don't even remember that plot point at all.
Oh, yeah,
I only
it was
saw that movie once though, so I guess so. It's like I remember that general thrust of like these reboots of like problematizing, who's the villain and who's the hero and all that. But like,
Mhm.
I don't even remember the specific.
Well, I remember it only because, again, I'm a huge Star Wars
Yeah.
nerd, and I notice these things probably even more than most people, because it's so in your face to
Yeah.
me as someone who's looking at it from a relativistic lens. I think it was I probably first got my periphery, or my vision, I should say, by Batman. I mean, Batman.
Yeah.
You remember that scene? I mean, I actually liked the scene as a self-proclaimed libertarian. I really enjoyed seeing like this scene in which Batman is facing a situation in which he must track down the bad guy, Joker, I think it was at the time. But to do so, he had to violate the rights or the privacy rights of every single member and citizen of Gotham. And you're like, you must only use this once for this one very specific thing, and then you must dismantle this machine. It is too powerful to one use. And I don't mean to say that there's any that this is necessarily a bad or good thing in media, or in multimedia or film, literature, any of the arts. These concepts, these philosophical concepts, I think are very important. Because life is not black and white. Life is not binary, and I think that this is where these concepts deserve to be. But it's when you take a concept like that is relativistic, and then you make everything into that, and you make that the pillar or the focal point of your message, instead of making it one element.
Here's interesting. I mean, other than in film or art or whatever, is this something that you've seen in your life with friends or with business associates, or because there's this, one critical avenue would say, well, okay, maybe we're just asking these sorts of things in art and stuff, and it's not really pervasive in culture. So it's like, I don't know. Do you feel like this has really permeated most people's consciousness, or do you think it's just sort of a?
Yeah, I think that it's like a circle. You can't say that it exists in art and literature, and it's impossible to not indelibly impregnate the entire cultural phenomenon. I think again, postmodernism as a zeitgeist has, by virtue of the fact it's in our art, is almost indicative or proves the fact that it's in our our psyche and our ethos. So yeah, absolutely, I see it in the day to day. I see it in the matter of just the fact that when you look at. I don't know if this directly answers your question about my personal experience, other than the fact that it impacts us all. But the whole nature of money in this country and probably every other country in the world is like we look at money as just this thing that doesn't have any. We know it doesn't have value. We know that fiat is just printed representation of something physical, but then we've gotten so far removed from the actual thing that had any value. So when our governments print money with reckless abandon, like it did to counter, say, COVID, we look at that and we say, well, what's the difference if it prints $1 trillion or it prints $100 million? It's all, these numbers are so large and so astronomical that it's like it loses all basis in reality. And so we say, and that's where the nature of what's called modern monetary theory comes into play, or MMT, because I think that is a direct representation on the economic sphere of the postmodern lens.
So there's this idea of social constructivism, that it's sort of like we collectively create reality, and then in the domain of economics, that becomes we collectively create value or adjudicate value, and so we can just sort of collectively. I mean, all right. Here's an interesting question. I mean, so we do collectively determine value to some degree, right? So where do you think it goes wrong by just saying all right, well, if we can all just be on the same page about the fact that we do that, then we can just sort of, extend that further and extrapolate it, and then just sort of live in utopia because we can print as much money as we want, because this is ultimately sort of a game we're all playing with each other. And as long as the game keeps going, then we can play this infinite game.
Well, I think that's the same mindset that, say, someone who's practicing a Ponzi scheme would enjoy, because you're right, the game will go on indefinitely until someone decides they want to get their money out.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem that we face. It really is the same phenomenon, because, again, think about a Ponzi scheme, just to break it down for a second. You have money flowing into a system that's set up to basically then generate artificial returns and pay back your quote-unquote investors. And this phenomenon will continue, this cycle will continue over and over again as long as you can get enough money in to satisfy.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? And
Yeah,
the
yeah, I
ball
do.
doesn't drop until
okay.
someone asks for their money back.
But so here's an interesting angle to this. So Sam Bankman-Fried.
Great example.
Obviously, he's going to jail for fraud, presumably. I mean, he was indicted, he was convicted, and now we don't know how long, what his sentence will be. But I guess the question would be, using that as an example, someone says, oh, there's this great new thing, this great new service, and they hype it up, and they get investment, they get people to pour their money in, and then it doesn't come to fruition. Or another example would be like the Fire Festival. Do you remember that?
I do, yeah.
So like you generate all this hype and whatever, right? And then you get all this engagement, and then you... So here's a question I would ask.
I think you're proving examples of what I'm trying to explain.
But here's the difference, though, is that I think that there's sort of a retroactive thing here, because, all right, let's say I create a product. I say, oh, I have Hope Joes, and they're the coolest thing ever. And all of a sudden, I get all this interest in it. People pour money into it. There's all this capital. And then I create the Hope Joes, and then all of a sudden there's buyers. And then it's like, okay, yeah. And now I'm able to basically justify this infusion of capital and all this stuff. And but it's still at the level of sort of a social construction, right? Like Amazon, for example, like that money, that business was not making money for years and years.
Well, let's not conflate. So let's just address the Hope Joes for a second.
Well, all right, let me finish the thought experiment.
Yeah.
It's just sort of like, my concern would be that in our current regime, it seems like people become criminals if they are not successful. If Sam Bankman-Fried and if the Fire Festival guy and all that, if it had worked, we would say, oh, they're great entrepreneurs. They did it, right? Yeah. But because of the accidents of whatever, then we say, oh, they're frauds, and they should go to jail for decades, if not, a century. So why is, and one could make the case that, like, if they're successful, then it's successful capitalism, that someone has generated interest in this product, and then it might be hype, but like as long as people are willing to give you money, then it's the whole thing. It's like all of a sudden this person has done this thing in the system, and now they are an entrepreneurial god, and then but if it doesn't work, then we like send them to jail. So where's the difference between like fraud versus just like hyping capitalists, as you should do?
Yeah, no, these are great questions. I think that here's my perspective. I think these are the questions I think need to be asked, not just by...
That's the questions that I ask.
People dwelling
on
in
the podcast.
I know. Well, these are the questions that matter, and these are unfortunately the questions that aren't kind of brought to the public in any reasonable way. Yeah. Again, I watch a lot of CNBC, financial networks, and again, like you
Jim Cramer's going to be on there hyping up.
Yes.
Oh, Fire Festival. Oh,
that's exactly what I was about to mention. Is you find these charlatans out there. I think I'd put Jim Cramer in that camp, Sam Bankman-Fried, and again, I would put a long laundry list of other things in that list, which I think you're right that the shoe will drop on anything that doesn't have substance. Will have the shoe drop. The question is, how quickly will it drop? And it is a factor or a byproduct of whether or not, quote unquote, success brings it to bear or not. Now, where I feel like these are these are examples of a common phenomenon that's been happening since the dawn of man. There is nothing new under the sun, you know. So basically, these concepts are like, people see cryptocurrency, for example, and they're like, this is a whole new thing. This is so exciting. This is the best thing since sliced bread or the internet.
Yeah.
And maybe that is possibly true for one, two, or several, or multiple of these cryptos, but that is not possible that it's for all of them. There is going to be this window dressing that exists for a large number of speculative assets that have been created over the last, say, 30 years, especially in the last 5 years. And the nature of fraud is very common throughout history, since the history of mankind. We have just made it seem complex and nuanced and involved and very beyond the ken of your average person. And so, you know, again, I watched CNBC, and you had Sam Bankman-Fried on there every other third day, and he was heralded as just a brilliant person and an absolute genius and doing innovative things. And it wasn't until everything hit the fan and you had the bankruptcy executive brought in to take over for him as CEO, and he looks at the landscape of shenanigans that he got given access to, and he looks at, gets indicted, he gets in front of Congress and they ask him, what's going on here? Is this some complex things that the world's never seen before? And he's like, no, this is just general vanilla and plain as vanilla fraud with just this completely convoluted veneer to it. And that's what's happening, I think, in all these cases. And I think Sam Bankman-Fried actually is a great example of the byproduct of a postmodern disease that has permeated culture and certainly the financial networks, because people get so caught up in the, I don't know what's true. Your true is not necessarily what I used to think of as true. I used to think of as a reasonable investment or a reasonable case for putting my money into something is no longer the case. And so maybe these complicated instruments that are just air on top of air on top of air is actually wrapped in this beautiful, digital token is actually worth something.
Yeah.
And it isn't until someone says the emperor has no clothes that
that's
they.
Great. So no. Okay. So literally people have bought NFTs. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
For
great example.
Thousands, millions of dollars. I think at this point there have been purchases of NFTs in the millions.
Wouldn't you not say? Maybe I'm not supposed to ask questions of you directly.
No. Go ahead.
But to me, that is the quintessential depiction of the economic lens into postmodernism. Basically, it's postmodernism through an economic lens.
But so then explain that. Why? All right. Well, okay. But
it is nothing.
Yeah.
It is. It's vapid nothing. We have decided to put a label on it, being that this thing, your reality saying that something to have value needs to be worthwhile or useful, but my reality of that context doesn't really mean anything, because I'm going to choose my own reality, and I'm going to say that this NFT, this nothing that you're calling a digital token has value, and then someone else is going to say, by virtue of it having value, then I'm going to buy it. Yeah. And then they're going to say, well, the greater fool theory says, well, if I buy it, then the next idiot's going to buy it.
But let's break that down. Okay, and we can even go back, actually, to make a very direct connection with postmodernism. A lot of postmodern art, so you wind up seeing these postmodern works of art being sold for exorbitant amounts of money, like $30 million for basically just
basketball in a pool.
Yeah, water. Exactly. These like Damien Hirst and whatever. It's just garbage, and it's interesting though at a economic level, because people are literally buying these works of art. In some ways to sort of do money laundering. They're like, this is a way for me to gain an asset that, as long as, I don't want to overload this question too much, but I'm trying to make the connection at the very least to the notion that we've already seen in the late 90s people buying postmodern works of art for millions of dollars. That's literally just like, slop on a canvas.
Sure.
But because there's this shared sense of, but this is supposedly worth something, therefore it's not fraud, then they can get away with it. So then it just seems like a natural carryover into the NFT world of like, this is a JPEG that you can literally download for free, or you can pay me $30 million for it. It's like, okay, But it's the same thing with like anyone can slap a banana on a wall and duct tape it, but one's a work of art that costs $25 million and the other's just, nothing, right? So I guess it all gets down to the issue of value. Like, who is adjudicating the value here? And that question for me is ultimately one of fraud. Like, are people playing games, or is there genuinely a sense that this is legitimate art or value that people are investing in? But there seem to be a number of there's a constellation of issues going on here. One is like aesthetic value that's subjective, so people feel like they can just wiggle it, and be like, well, I see something of great value here and you don't, and whatever. And then there's also issues of financial, economic, like a need to basically have assets that you're investing in that you want to see appreciate over time, and this could just be a totally fabricated way of gaining value in a financial way. And then there's this philosophical undertone to all this, which is like, well, who's to say? And if you can justify all of this with this like philosophical pretense of, well, whatever, then you can get away with it. So I don't even know what the question is in there, but like,
Well, no, I think just the fact that we're musing about these topics is it is not it's a very nuanced, non-binary related concept, because it has all these facets, it has all these layers, and I also don't want to get to the perspective where I'm conflating the fact all bubbles are a byproduct of postmodernism either.
Right.
I mean, bubbles pre-exist.
And I want to come back to that.
Like tulip bubble of the 18th, whatever 70s. It obviously predates postmodernism, but I think the nature of taking something and making value subjective is something that is innately not unique, but is much more indicative of the postmodern framework than I think any other framework before it. So I think that's why we're seeing so many bubbles now. That's why we're seeing so much subjectivity around what I would say objective truths now more than ever, which again, I have no problem. Well, I have less of a problem with it inundating our art or our artistic landscapes and various endeavors there than I do if it getting involved in our financial and politics.
But two thoughts here. One is, so I don't see the difference between, let's say someone buys, the work I'm talking about. Someone put a banana on the wall with duct tape and they sold it for millions of dollars.
I'm familiar with that
piece. It was literally a banana on a wall with duct tape. I should have the title, but it was
duct tape banana.
Duct tape banana.
Yeah.
So that work sold for millions of dollars. Now, I don't see the difference between, let's say that person then goes to sell that work of art and someone only wants to give them $10 for it. Now that person can say, I've been defrauded. I can go to the U.S. government and say, look, I bought this I thought it was all this value, and then it turned out to be garbage. How is that any different from what Sam Bankman-Fried did? You know what I mean? Like, that's the question for me, is like, what is the difference? Why is he going to jail forever?
Well,
and that
I can answer at least that. I mean,
okay.
So a couple points. So one is, I think what's happened in modern art, extrapolate that over to the NFT landscape and a lot of crypto space. I'm a little jaded about some crypto, not all, but I feel that basically technology has allowed us to expedite a lot of our innate ability to make the subjectivity of value, and just at a massive scale allow us to bring it to an area that it would never have gotten to naturally. Just like leverage and some of these financial products that existed in 2008 allowed the financial collapse of the mortgage market in a way that never would have happened naturally. It's only when you have these like CDOs and synthetic CDOs, which takes leverage at 1 to 1,000, 1 to 1,000,000, and put the situation that made the housing collapse, basically a deck of cards or a house of cards, collapse so much further. Now you have technology basically layered onto our own innate ability to try to create, I think as human beings, this is maybe a philosophical point, but we love the subjectivity of value. I mean, that's why one of the reasons why, like, the whole, I think it was whose model of value was quickly like debunked very early on. It was saying, value comes out as a natural byproduct of the inputs. You know, I think it was probably Marx, Karl Marx, who said that. And it was like very quickly shown, like, no, that's not how you get value. Is a very subjective thing. This has been very proved in 100 different ways. And we have a natural ability, I think, or a natural vice maybe as human beings, to want to make every little thing that we do, certainly in the artistic space, but in many others, very subjective. And technology has now just allowed that to happen at a level that could never have happened prior to it. So I think that's one level of this whole thing.
Yeah, but I'm missing something, and maybe it's all comes down to the specifics of these cases, right? Because like, there's got to be a situation where Sam Bankman-Fried said, "I promise you this," and he knew he was lying, and he knew, and that can be documented or something. Because I don't see the difference between. Let's say
Sam Bankman-Fried, just to be clear, isn't going to jail because he sold NFTs.
No, I know.
He very clearly violated every law in the book of how to deal with book. He didn't have so much as a QuickBooks account for as far as I'm aware. He didn't have ledger. He didn't have accounts receivable, payable. He was just doing things in bank accounts.
But why isn't that the problem of the people who invested with him? If he said, "Hey, give me your money," and they're stupid enough to give him their money, why is he going to jail? Whereas an artist who says, "Hey, this thing is worth $10 million," and then someone tries to sell it and they get $10, they're like, "Oh," but then it's like, "Oh, well, you got," you know what I mean? Why is it you got hosed versus?
I think I can answer that very easily. So art never comes with a guarantee. I mean, I could buy any piece of art, and no one's going to give you a certificate. They're going to give you a certificate of authenticity.
Yeah.
They're never going to say this is going to preserve its value, or more importantly, this is going to appreciate in value.
Okay.
That's more of a understanding or a assumption that you're making, a risk that you're taking as an investor. That's very different from, say, what Sam Bankman-Fried did or what Madoff did, where they said, "I'm going to take your money, and I'm going to give you a stated rate of return, and here's what that rate of return is. Here's your prospectus. Here's your financial expectation of returns, and I'm going to invest in these products or whatever." He outright lied to his investors. He put he said, "I was going to put your money and do all these things." He didn't do that. He paid off. Again, I don't know if this necessarily going to make it into the fraud side of it, but obviously he paid off huge numbers of funds to both the DNC and RNC in order to fly under the radar.
Really?
Oh yeah, that's one of the things that's very most famous for is he called himself he was making all this money to quote unquote be a wealthy he thought money. I forget his exact quote. I'm gonna kill myself, or I can't figure it out for not remembering it. But it was basically his whole point was, I'm making money because not that I need it, because I just want to show what creating money is all about. It's for giving back to other people, and that was his big thing. So he gave most of it away. He donated it to a lot of political purposes, and I think a lot of people agree is that he did that to basically hide in plain sight. If I'm doing all these wonderful things and being all philanthropic, it's basically I'm now outside the realm of scrutiny. And so he flew below the radar for a number of years because he was able to basically have he was in the shadow of the political class, the elites. But anyway, I think that that's very different from, say, an artist, quote, I use that word very loosely, who's saying, "I'm going to put a banana on a wall and you're buying it from me." There is no guarantee that value is going to hold, and you, as someone buying that artwork, are never going to be able to go to the government to get the value of that value.
Well, that is an issue, though. I mean, an art, dealer who's trying to convince someone, he's like, "Oh, this work is really going to appreciate in value. You watch, this is going to double," and blah blah blah. I guess they're not saying anything contractually, and maybe that's ultimately where this all breaks down. Is like, if someone doesn't have their name on a piece of paper, and that's what it all comes down to. But it seems to me like it's not, there's a huge gray area in terms of like where we establish fraud and these sorts of things, because at the level of art, at the level of finances, there just seems to be a huge notion of, if we make things up, that's not the problem. As long as there's someone to as long as there's demand for the supply that we make up, then it's legal. As soon as there's not demand for the supply that we make up, then you go to jail.
Yeah.
That seems to me to be the
Sure.
what's the word? The perverse element to it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what
Yeah.
you mean, and I feel like that's the underlying. But I mentioned this earlier. I think it's not like it's any less illegal. It's just that you're going to find that it finds the light of day a lot quicker that way. That's why I feel like, to me, there's so many things. Forget what individuals are doing. I mean, frankly, I don't know how I don't get too controversial on this podcast, but that's what I think the United States is doing, and a massive, they're committing massive fraud and have for decades when it comes to like Social Security. I mean, like, that is, if you look at what Sam Bankman-Fried did or what Madoff did, and compare that what that's doing with Social Security, it's the exact same framework. You're basically taking money from a large swath of people. You're not putting it into the said lockbox or said, you're not sitting there and keeping that money under lock and key until it's given back to each person who's contributing to it. You're swashing it in with the rest of the funds. You're pulling it out. You're abusing it. You're not. That money's not going to be there. And the only reason that it's quote unquote going to be there when we retire is because we have access to a printing machine. And so the only reason that the Ponzi scheme of Social Security isn't going to make ahead, maybe in the same way that Sam Bankman-Fried's did, is because we have the ability to print more money, the United States government does. And so that money may be paid out, but it's not going to have the value. So I mean, we're still defrauding. It's just we do these things on a procedural level, on a systemic way,
right,
when it comes to.
But all right, let's move into that domain, because it seems like, all right, the contention here would be, or let's say you could make the claim that certain actions taken in different contexts become different actions, and what I mean by that would be. So one of the ideas of the government is like a monopoly of violence. Is that there's a notion that instead of basically having a bunch of mafiosos running around beating up people and trying to keep people in line in their local community, you basically outsource that to this sort of like supra level mafioso level, and they're then in charge of all the mafiosos. And then the nice thing about it is that then you don't have to worry about being pushed around by your local mafioso. You're being pushed around by this sort of faceless government entity, which is at least degraded in its capacity to violate you because of its own ineptitude. Anyway, but
that has its own. I mean, I think Kafka got into this a lot when basically it's like, I'd almost prefer to be able to put a face to my abuser than have this nameless, this nebulous force shrouded in the darkness eventually pull me out behind the water cooler and shoot me. It's kind of like it's like pick your poison. This doesn't really necessarily get you in a better place. But anyway, I see what your point is.
Yeah, so I'm trying to consider this idea of is there ever an instance where you could isolate the phenomenon that we're talking about, and then all of a sudden it's different because there's different contextual constraints on it. So in this context, right, it's like it's fraud if citizens do it, but if it's the government doing it, it's legal. But not, and so I think where we would differ would be, you would say it's the same thing and it's still fraud, and then what I'm interested in exploring is being like, well, maybe there are instances where if it's the government doing it, it makes sense. You know what I mean?
Well, I look at things. This is actually ironically an area where I feel like I do take more of a binary approach to certain issues, and one of those issues is morality and ethics. And like when it comes to whether governments or individuals are doing something, to me, it's a moral position. As a libertarian, I think that as a moral framework, we look at things and we say, what is the correct moral position and how to approach the subject? And I don't care if it's a bunch of people that are doing it in back rooms, or whether it's an individual that's doing it in a corporation. These are still morally wrong actions. And it's like the group setting, whether no matter how big the group and how much plurality there is in the who elected them, quote unquote.
All right.
It does not change the ethics
All
behind
right. Well, let
the
me
underlying action.
I'll set up something, and this I think will all come back. So it'll take a little bit to get there. So one of the ways of thinking about the history of how like the state evolves and everything is like, and you can actually track this historically, is about blood vendettas, sort of a thing where it's like
You and I had one for a while.
That's right.
We
Yeah.
realized we were in the same blood and we canceled it out.
Right, but there'd be these things where like, oh, this group of people killed our tribe member, and now we need to go attack them and kill one of their tribe members. And now they, in response to that, need to come back and kill one of us, and it just becomes this endless tribal violence, basically. And this is sort of the idea of like a vendetta of like, as soon as there's some wrong done to one group, there's
I saw Godfather. I get it.
Yeah, okay. So that's the logic of it. And you can see this is an anthropological sort of thing that like this happens all the time. Okay. So how do you stop the cycle of violence, right? One way to do it is eventually to be like, oh, we don't just go as a group and go kill the other group to like get, because we know that will just perpetuate the cycle of violence. What we do instead is we set up a shared tribunal of people that we give authority to, and they are in a position to adjudicate the lawful, basically, repercussions. And so in that case, we accept the decision of this tribunal to establish, who is in the wrong. And then if they say, okay, this group was in the wrong, this person killed someone, they get put to death, there's no one anymore that you can attack because it's at a higher level. You'd have to overthrow the government to like do the vendetta. So then it's just considered done, right? So for example, right, like instead of this group A comes over and kills our brother, and then we go and kill one of their brothers, and so on and so forth, and an endless thing. Instead, Group A comes over, kills our brother. We go to the tribunal and we say, hey, Group A just killed our brother. They adjudicate it. There's some kind of lawful process, and this is like this. Then you start getting into the whole rule of law thing, and then it's like, okay, this person killed this person. This person is responsible. This person, let's just say, will be put to death or whatever punishment you want to say, and then that puts an end to it. And now you've ended the cycle of violence, and you can actually look back at like the whole. It's the Antigone Oedipus story, actually, in Greek mythology that basically commemorates this transition into a legal system. And then the idea would be we've somehow progressed. We've moved into a different area of resolving these differences. And we do that through collective action in a way that we basically surrender the adjudication process to the state, quote unquote, and then we're all better off.
Yeah, I have no problem with any of that. But I think the part that you're missing there is that all the parties had to agree that the agency had to be given up and given to this third party, this arbiter, and that's the part where we have.
Okay, but then
it's a nuance, but it's very important.
But let's say then let's say 3 generations go by, and now all of a sudden people are just born into the system. This is just the way we handle these things. Does that mean all of a sudden this has become profoundly unjust because everyone in the society is no longer directly giving consent to this tribunal to do this? Like, does every single person who enters into a social situation have to literally sign a social contract before there's some recognition that, like, this is a justified way of solving these issues?
Well, I mean, this is taking a turn I wasn't necessarily prepared to talk about, but it's definitely, I think it gets to the heart of what is the role of the individual in where does agency begin and where does it end in decision making, whether it comes to adjudicating lawful or unlawful activities to getting involved in contracts and things, and who's going to enforce these things. I think that the heart of the matter is always going to be who is going to have the end at the end of the day, who's going to have the final say on the situation and whether or not the individual is playing a role in that. And the big problem to me that I have in your scenario is like there is not what's to keep, let's say, 3 generations hence this organization from going rogue and becoming no better or no worse or much worse than the original offenders and committing great and heinous sins against the society, which is what I would argue is happening today, where you now have just as much evil perpetuated by the what's supposedly the arbiters of truth as you have is by the individuals who put those people in place.
But in that situation, it's still that it's not on principle. Like, on principle, it's possible that we could show up in a society and not literally have to like be part of a social contract.
Yeah.
And still recognize that like the state can adjudicate issues, and that is justified, and that's all right. Now, all right. So let's try to bring this back into the broader conversation.
Yeah, this is definitely a rabbit hole. I
okay,
think,
so what I'm getting at,
one,
but what I'm getting at here is that there are situations where I'm trying to foreground that with this issue of the state using a monopoly of violence to maybe enact the collective good. If the state is issuing money, they might be in a unique situation that is not found in other situations of individuals acting amongst individuals, in the same way that the monopoly of violence does not operate the same way that mafiosos interacting operate. As soon as you monopolize something, you've changed the dynamic, you've changed the incentive structure, you've changed the whole game, really. It's a game changer, and arguably it's a complexification game changer where you've sort of shifted up into a new level. So then the question for me would be, why not look at the shift in the generation of money and value in the same way? And this would be, I think, a deep, no one's talking about MMT this way, but this would be the idea, I think, at the core of it, which is like, all right, if we've monopolized the issuance of money, then we can't use the same logic of individuals operating with each other to assess our own success, or that criteria, that set of criteria does not apply. Do you know what I mean? And then you're playing a different game at that point.
Yeah, you are. I think sometimes in matters of economics, especially of fiat and money, it becomes very easy to kind of evolve or devolve the conversation into it's so complex or so it's at a level that it needs to be kind of deconstructed and deconstructed from there. I think that does it a disservice because it's not properly putting things in the context of the situation with money. It is simply an exchange of goods for goods, essentially. When we go back to a barter or trade economy, you're basically you have something I want, I have something you want, and we want to trade. Money is simply the fungible means in which we are able to say, all right, you have a turkey, I have a...
Backed up by violence.
Well, now we're talking about the state side of it. Well, I'm just take that out of it for a second. I'm just trying to say, take the fiat component out for a second. Just bring it back to like the basic side of economics 101. And it's like, you have a turkey, I have a mule. Your turkey's worth significantly less than my mule. So how many turkeys does it take to equal my mule? Well, you only have 6 turkeys. I have a mule. That's not quite enough, or that's maybe too many. So it becomes you use eventually came along gold, right? And now you could hack this thing that was divisible into various parts. Silver as another medium of exchange. And anyway, money became the fluid way in which you could exchange and barter goods. Obviously, that's evolved over 5, 6, 10,000 years, and now you've gotten to the point where we've basically taken out the chickens and the chickens and the or I should say and the mules are still there, but we're no longer using something that's backed by any value, and
But,
that's the
okay.
fundamental problem here, is that
Yeah.
we're not going back to the fact that we're recognizing that the reason these things have value is that they were related to the reason gold and silver had value is because you could say, all right, this ounce of gold is worth this many turkeys or chickens, this many mules, and that's why it had values. You could basically draw that correlation. Now we've taken all the value out of the system. The value's gone. We've created this nebulous vacuum in its place, and now we're just trading with the empty currency without anything to back it up. And so that when we print this money, when we overinflate the currency, what we're doing is we're not allowing. We have to, by virtue of that happening, basically make the dollars that we're spending are going to be worth less and less and less as we perpetuate this cycle.
So I get the argument, and I find it very compelling, but it's also worth interrogating, right? Because if you can interrogate it and find a way in which you can manipulate it, it could be of incredible value, to be quite frank, right?
I mean, it's it's like saying, well, it'd be incredible value if I was able to turn lead into gold. I mean, it's this nebulous concept that it's not possible to take nothing and turn it into something. It's not possible to change the laws. This is, again, a postmodern concept that says, well, what if? What if the reality was different?
But here's the angle I'm trying to explore here, though, because literally we've done this.
Well, we've done this until the shoe drops, like I said, until the Ponzi scheme collapses.
But you're framing it in those terms. Another way to frame it is that if money is the fiat currency of a monopolistic power that has behind it the monopoly of violence, that's basically able to engage in a process of, let's call it, all right, the entire logic behind MMT is saying the government is issuing money to itself. And so if it's doing that, why not just give itself more money? Now, the only answer to that makes any economic sense is that we are a global superpower that is the global basis of current, other economies peg their value of their dollar to our dollar.
Yeah, the fact that we are the world reserve currency gives us a position of power and influence that we have abused it.
Sure.
Let me give you an example, and I don't know if this is going off the rails, but and this is a silly example, but it's one that comes top of my mouth. Let's just say that I owned a golf course, all right, and you're an avid golfer, and it was the best golf course in town, and you, Brennan, were decided to come to my golf course, and you said, all right, well, here's $80 to play in your golf course, and I said, oh, don't worry about it, your money's no good here, I'll put it on your tab, right? Yeah. And you said, oh, that sounds great. And so you do that, and eventually, let's say you do that this week, you come back again next week, you keep doing this, and I keep saying, no, just put, build up a tab, right? Yeah. Month after month goes by, and I realize that, well, gosh, or you realize, I should say, not me, but you're like, I can just keep playing for free. I don't really, you got this tab going, and however, over time, I'm realizing that I can just take this golf course and I don't need to maintain it. I start letting it go to pot. I start not mowing the grass. Let some of my people go, and so you've built out this huge tab here, basically. Yeah. And essentially, I could just walk. After maybe let's say 6-7 years, this maybe golf course isn't even playable anymore. Yeah. And you've got this great credit here, but you're not able to use it essentially because there's no golf course. There's nothing to actually enjoy. Yeah. It's like that's the same thing that's happening at a macro level. I think in the United States is we keep putting all this faith in this institution and saying that your money is going to be in this space, but it's only as good as until you go to draw upon your credit. And once you go and actually, again, once the Ponzi scheme, so you start pulling the money out, that's when the shoe drops. And again, this is not going to happen in country. This is going to happen out of country. This is going to be like China, Japan. Our borrowing partners are going to come to us and say, well, now all that money that all that good credit that we've built up in your country, we want to get some of that out. And we're probably going to get to the point where we say we don't have any of that, or if we have it, we're just going to print it off and send it to you. And I think that's the problem that we have here, facing, again, this, not maybe our generation, but maybe the generation to follow, is like, we do not realize that practices like MMT and building up these shadow currencies on top of these shadows on top of shadows is not a sustainable path forward. There's no amount of alchemy that we can bring to the table that's going to take nothing and turn it into something. All we have is, like Titanic, quote unquote Titanic, all we have is a series of bad debts and a good name. We don't have any actual assets to back up what we've put in place. And I think, again, bring it back to postmodernism. It's like we have learned as a society globally to just accept on blind faith the fact that the reality is what it is, because everyone's going along with it, and none of us has had the courage or interest, rather, to even say, man, that emperor looks naked. That we're just happy to go along with it because we, especially as Americans, are the ones benefiting from the fact that we're the world reserve currency.
I suppose the fundamental difference is that, hypothetically, what I've been trying to articulate is that it is possible to get an influx of capital entirely on hype and then use that to generate real value that ultimately retroactively justifies the infusion of capital that you could actually make money off of.
Interesting.
But that presumes that you're actually generating real value. Yeah. And in this case, then the question would be, what would be the real value?
Yeah, so right now, that's a funny point. I never considered that, but if in this hypothetical scenario, let's say AI, which is controlled by a U.S. company, at least we have to figure that out for sure. I'm under the assumption that Microsoft owns OpenAI. I might be wrong about it, but I'm pretty sure they do. And let's just say that OpenAI or AI in general winds up revolutionizing the entire world in a way that we cannot even imagine, and that wealth is somehow brought back to America. Okay. You're right. Those bad debts that we've seeded for the last 100 years, we might be able to finally pay them. But right now, the coffers are bare. And it's like, unless something magical and mystical and unknown happens, we got to accept. It's just like the same thing could have happened to Sam Bankman-Fried. I mean, he could have, in the 11th hour, gotten this magical infusion of capital from a unknown philanthropist. But it's like, that's not the way to run a country, is hoping for some Hail Mary in the ninth inning. You want to have a sustainable economy that's built on something. And that's, again, going back to MMT for a second. It's like, or not even MMT, but just in general economics, the world seems to think that even things like the way that we base how we're measuring prosperity is based on measurements like gross domestic product, GDP. This is all based on spending. You don't. So this is, again, a matter of opinion, and I feel very strongly about this, and a lot of people agree with me. Austrian economics is grossed in this camp, but you should not measure the prosperity of a nation based on how much it spends and how profligate it is. You want to measure a nation's resistancy and its austerity based on how much it's producing.
Well, I think we could find some very genuine agreement, because I think that it seems to me that we are in a situation where we conflate things like spending with growth, and then you can get into ridiculous, confusions like, oh, a hurricane comes in and then we have to spend more to build up, and then all of a sudden this is like a
great boon for us, because what's the broken window fallacy?
Yeah, exactly.
Everyone, if they haven't, every one of your listeners, if they tune me out, fine. Go and buy the book Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. Best 100 pages of literature on this topic you'll ever read, which is about why it's such a fallacy to say hey, if something breaks, or if I go to war,
Yeah.
if I break a window, this is, again, you have Keynesian economists say this is the best thing
Yeah.
for our society, because now we have to spend this money on building that window back up, on on going to war and throwing it back into our economy, on repairing this broken business that now we have to, or whatever the situation is. And this is like the biggest fallacy that's ever existed in the monetary space.
So there needs to be some basis for value, like establishing the genuine creation of value,
Yes.
which it does, and I'm inclined to agree with you that it seems like we've lost touch with that, because
But do you think that so this is my premise,
Yeah.
our premise of this discussion. I would say that's the reason we've lost touch with that is a byproduct of the postmodern era. Do you think that that's an oversimplification?
I find there to be a very fascinating, compelling case to be made that there is a deep connection down to the year. Basically it's 1973, and you see this shift from, the gold standard into this fiat currency. And over the course of a couple of years, you shift from grounding value in goods to this sort of floating value that then becomes the basis for this sort of like, the 80s boom. And then you can track this on graphs. You can read David Harvey's The Condition of Postmodernity through this lens, and it's fascinating because the entire notion becomes like, as soon as you divorce, like the reality of financial situations from goods, you can just propagate this like house of cards. But then the question is, can you ground it? That's for me the remaining open question is like, is this critique a reactionary critique, or is it like this is the critique that needs to be leveraged? Because there's an option that I'm open to, which is like that we just discovered, that we deconstructed value, and we're like, now that we know that value is a social construct, we can leverage that to the collective benefit. I don't think that's what people are doing, but I think that that's a possibility. So one of the ways that I'm interested in that being a reality, right, is that, like, let's say you basically just take this massive loan out on society, and then you're like, we're just going to spend $1 trillion on education. Now, this would never happen, but let's just say you did that. This is completely financially irresponsible. But in a generation, if you did
More
it,
responsible doing that than what we're doing.
that's what. Well, certainly. I mean,
Spent
if you
$1 trillion on our debt servicing alone last year.
yeah, I mean, if you took the money that we spent on foreign wars and put that into
Sure.
education, then it's like that's a genuine investment, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the whole notion of an investment, right, is like you're literally borrowing from today to make more money tomorrow. And there's a way you can do that responsibly, and there's a way you can do that irresponsibly. And I think you're making the case that postmodernism represents this sort of way of looking at the world that is sort of like we are borrowing from our future in a way that's irresponsible. But there's also this sort of like modernist realization that, I mean, capitalism is an invention of modernism, of like we can borrow from the present to make more money in the future. And no one before in the traditional world had considered that.
Well, a slight correction of the record. I wouldn't even say that capitalism, by definition, requires borrowing anything. You are using your savings to put money in. So the whole nature of investment, at least this is the way it's been for hundreds of years until maybe the modern era, is you build up, use time to build up a cash reserve. You have savings. And then you find an investment opportunity that you think is worth it, and you use those savings to invest in, let's say, that future return. It's not about borrowing money.
Well, there's two elements.
That's where borrowing has gotten added to the equation as been a requisite element to the picture. And I don't think that profligacy is a requirement to investment.
But like at the individual level, let's say I've saved, I've saved a lot of money, and then all of a sudden I'm going to just invest all of that money into something. that can be very risky for me because I could lose all of that money and then all of a sudden I'm destitute. So actually, I'm borrowing from my own savings in order to try to make money. But so there's that level. And then the other level is that we wind up inventing these financial instruments where people start realizing that, like, oh, okay, I'm valued at this amount, and so I can take out a loan at this amount, and so then I can put in to this new business this loan that I've taken out based on my financial credit to make money in this area. And then maybe you do make money in that area, and then your loan justifies people investing in your financial credibility in a way that like never existed in the ancient world, right?
Sure, yeah.
So that is both the genius and the downside of capitalism, is that when that goes wrong, and this brings it all back, when that goes wrong, it all falls apart. And that is for me the big question. It's like, why is Sam Bankman-Fried not just like, you know?
All right, so I think it's very important not to conflate a lot of things. Sometimes it's so easy for folks that don't say they don't spend their time and energies in looking into different like investment paradigms to easily conflate investing with speculating.
Yeah,
I would say that would be my first takeaway to what you said, and that folks who put their money. By the way, as a quick aside, best money for the best book for financial literacy you'll ever read is Richest Man in Babylon. I think a book I might have given you.
Yes.
I don't know. I love it. But anyway, that aside, the whole nature of investing is about taking your money and putting it into things with a risk threshold that is reasonable and expected, so you can actually measure the risk and know what that is, and you're going to be getting some sort of measured return. Usually it's a dividend or a rent payment, or if it's a bond, you're getting a coupon back. You're getting some sort of known rate of return. That's an investment. This is by definition. Speculation, very different. Now you're putting your money and hoping either that another fool, for the really bad speculation, that another fool comes along and will take, like we're talking about your modern art, right? That someone will buy your investment, quote unquote, your speculatory asset, and buy it at a greater price. That's speculation. That's where you have no idea. You may get a moonshot, you may get 10x, or you may lose your entire investment or entire principal. That is not investing. And I know that's probably some might say a difference without a distinction.
It is,
but it
I don't
is very
understand.
important. And it's very important, I think a lot of people should take stock in these definitions, because investments are going to have a very understood and time-honored rate of return and risk that comes along with it. So take, for example, well, I don't even, it doesn't matter even giving examples, but it's something that you can put your money, you're not truly putting it at, it's not like you're going to wake up tomorrow and your money is going to be gone. It's like you're investing it into some crypto that you've never heard of.
This is news to me, because as far as I'm concerned, this is how...
Oh, this is very important. This is
I
how I
know.
this is a financial paradigm in which I live my life, and most people should. People who take their money and put it into financial instruments that they don't understand, or they could lose in a heartbeat, they're not investing their money. That's the wrong verb.
they're gambling.
They're gambling their money, speculating their money.
I don't think, though, that in this situation anyone has any alternative besides gambling.
Well, maybe. I don't know if it's too personal to say, but like in your situation, you purchased a home. Yeah,
and I'm selling the home, and I'm going to get this sudden windfall of money, and now I'm looking for a place to put that money in, like a...
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about that for a second. So when you bought a piece of real estate, let's not be too specific about it, but you bought real estate, would you agree with me that there was very little chance that, say, days, months, even years after buying that real estate, that you'd wake up and it's worth nothing?
Yeah, no, I was not. That's not.
In the same way, you could probably say, I'm expecting to appreciate, hopefully, but I don't need it to. I mean, it's preserving my wealth. You're able to rent it out. You're getting rent payments. There's your quote unquote dividend. You're getting a nominal or known coupon back to you every single month. That is an investment, because you're putting into a stable asset that is not going to fluctuate wildly. And in this case, it went up significantly.
It did fluctuate
we'll talk about
yeah,
that.
yeah.
But you're putting your money in a place where it's stabilizing, and you're getting a monthly income from that. Again, and we could be talking about stocks, we could be talking about bonds, in this case real estate, but these are investment paradigms that are so critical. And those three things, you're putting it into something that's not going to fluctuate wildly, stabilize your asset price. B, it's going to bring you some sort of monthly or annual, doesn't have to be monthly, but some sort of return on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, rent. If it was stocks, it'd be a dividend. In bonds, it'd be a coupon. And then C, you'll be able to basically pull yourself out. You're hoping essentially that you're going to appreciate on that asset
Mm-hmm.
over time. Or if it doesn't appreciate, you'll at least be able to sell it for pretty darn close to what you paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
Investment. That is all three tenets of those things make up an investment. So look at all the things that like Sam Bankman-Fried did and other Ponzi artists do. Modern art. If you were to take that X number, amount of money, pile of money, and you put it into, say, banana art,
Yeah.
saying, "Hey, I bought this thing for a song. It usually goes for $1 million. I got this thing for $20,000."
Well,
what are the chances that
Yeah.
thing is it going to produce dividends or any sort of monthly income? No.
Yeah.
Is it going to potentially wake up tomorrow and it's worth nothing? Yes.
Well,
Right?
no, but here's the example I would use, right? Is that like, let's say someone says, I want to start a restaurant, and I'm noticing a trend. Everyone is so into pineapples. Like, the pineapples are crazy right now.
Pineapples are really
They're huge. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to buy this property. I'm going to turn it into a pineapple restaurant, and all we sell is pineapples. And I guarantee you, there's a craze. It's going to be wild. And now, let's say I'm an investor, and I'm like, okay, I'm seeing the same trend. I watch these Gen Z, and they're crazy about their pineapples.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to make bank here. So you don't have the money yourself to buy this property in this restaurant, but I will give you $1 million, or let's say $800,000, to buy this property.
Why'd you change it?
It's
It's crazy that it would be $1 million, but 800,000.
let's say $1 million. I will give you $1 million, and you will start the pineapple restaurant, and I am expecting to make a lot of money from this.
Yeah, you don't have to spend too much time on this example. This is
Yeah.
obvious to me. This is speculation. I mean, anyone who knows their worth their salt is going to say it doesn't matter if the guy has even a strong business plan, unless this guy has been. This is the difference. And now, when you're starting a business, now you're getting a little more nuance. Of course, it's not as pie in the sky as banana art, but what separates a speculatory asset from an investment now does the guy, what we call whoever's executing on this plan, he's the operator, does he have experience running a pineapple restaurant or pineapple business?
Yeah.
If he does not, you are speculating. If he has 6 other restaurants or whatever the hell he's doing under his belt, now you're investing, because now you have a tried and true record. You can look at his pro forma.
So
you can
that's
look at
the difference.
Totally, the difference is you have to have proof that this is a business plan that has preceded and demonstrated returns.
But this is my whole point, though, is that this is purely just. This is what differentiates being risk averse, being open versus being open to risk. Because like Bill Gates had never started a Microsoft organization
to
before.
be clear, and I don't want to paint too broad of a brush here. There's nothing quote unquote wrong with speculating.
Okay.
A lot of the businesses in the world were started with speculation. But it's important to me that you recognize
the difference.
The difference is you can speculate with your money, but most people are throwing either all their money.
But what I don't understand is why some speculators who fail go to jail, and other people are just like.
No, that's a gross exaggeration. Speculators who do not go to jail for speculating; they go to jail for embezzlement or fraud. Right. Again, what Sam
and you'd have to show
you were saying.
Lying
this goes back to what we said before. Sam Bankman-Fried is not going to jail because he put a coin out there. Yeah. He went to jail because he promised to do things that he didn't do. He lied to his investors. I think that's a very important distinction, is that Ponzi artists are not just speculating and they lost their shirt and now they're going to jail. Okay. No, they're going to jail because they have defrauded their investors. And so then
you'd have to define defrauding, and so you'd have to say they said that this.
Yeah.
But then the question is, so. Right? Like someone says, I tell you what, invest in my company, and and you're going to make a lot of money because the pineapples are huge. And then it doesn't work out. Now, that person said something that did not happen. How come that they don't go to jail? They led a whole group of people to give them a lot of money based on what they said, and then it didn't happen. It just seems to me to be, it like hinges on certain kinds of legalese.
No, there's gray area. I'm not saying it's black and white, but I think again, this is to me, it's much more black and white than I think you're giving it credit for.
Okay.
It's like speculators are never going to tell you that there's a sure thing. They're going to say that this is an investment. If you put your money into it, you could lose it all, or you could gain it all.
So you got to be upfront with that.
I do a lot of speculating. I speculate when I build several of my businesses. I put my money at risk without any guarantees.
Well, and this all gets back to the initial question, which is about postmodernism, because the critique of this whole postmodern perspective would be that it's all speculation because everyone just says it's whatever you want it to be, and it doesn't matter, and so there's no basis of value, and it's all just subjective.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what the motor of the conversation for me is like I see so much of that in established capitalist practice that trying to differentiate when it's just speculative postmodern nonsense versus is very hard.
That's a great criticism, and I can't argue with that. Like there's a lot. Like okay, so let's talk about in the corporate world. Amazon, you brought them up earlier, I think, or maybe I forget which business you did, but So a lot of folks will say that they're engaging in typical capitalistic enterprise, and that has led to the wealth of Jeff Bezos, right? Yeah. I would say let's put a finer point on that. Whether or not Amazon does any of the business practices that it's being accused of, for better or worse, let's not even get into that quagmire. Let's just say that it does everything good about the company that people say. And I think it does a lot of good, frankly. I don't want to disenfranchise myself with your customers or with your listeners, but the biggest problem I find right now with companies or individuals like Jeff Bezos and the super wealthy that have kind of risen to this Lex Luthor-esque wealth, that they're just behemoths, billionaires many, many times over, has nothing to do with the products that they create. Mm-hmm. I'll say that again. Has nothing to do with the products they create, or very little to do with the products they create. What it has everything to do with is the fact that they are in an exchange called the Wall Street, the stock market, and now that they have assets, they have they own large swaths of the business. Huge. I don't want to know how much Jeff owns, but I want to say it's excess of 60% of the company is owned through stocks. Here's what happens, though. It's like when the Federal Reserve prints the money that we're talking about earlier, that inflates the currency. All that much of that money, if not most of that money, is now going into the stock market and inflating the price of these assets. So maybe it's not getting into your milk or your gas quite yet, but as soon as that money is printed, it's going somewhere. And most of the time, the banks have it flow right into the stock market, which is why you saw in the height of COVID, or excuse me, right following the height of COVID, you had what went up after all that money printing? You had the stock market more than double. What happens when the stock market doubles? Does it help the person that is struggling to feed their family? No, it doesn't. It helps the people with assets. It helps the people, frankly, that bought houses early on. Yeah. Their house prices go up. You were able to, good for you, sell your house for almost double what your people were.
It's totally arbitrary. I did not improve the value of that house.
No, you didn't.
But I'm able to capitalize on it.
Thank you. That's my very point. You didn't but just by sitting on an asset, you doubled your wealth in that, at least in that property. Mm-hmm. Jeff Bezos, he had trillion or hundreds of billions. Now he has almost $1 trillion. I mean, this is the wealth appreciation that happens in the United States. Nothing to do with the creation of goods. It's everything to do with the creation of money. And this is, again, the postmodern framework represented in an economic perspective, because without this whole, we can just print money. Like you were saying earlier, I think you have a lot of people that are like, well, why can't we just print all this money? And what I'm sure we can get away with it until that shoe hasn't fallen yet. So why don't we just keep running out the clock and hopefully something happens? And that may be all well and good in principle or in theory. Who is it hurting? It's making the rich super, super rich, and it's making the poor super, super poor. And so it's what that mentality does, MMT, Keynesian economics as well, is it's dividing the wealthy wealthiest from the poorest and creating this wealth gap and this wealth divide that is hundreds of times more than it ever was, even at the height in the 1920s with the Robert Barons and Vanderbilts and whoever else. I mean, it's like this is what creates it. It's this mentality that we can print our way into sustainability, and all it's doing is it's making the wealth very wealthy and it's making the poor very poor.
It is interesting, and we should close this off soon because we've probably reached an hour. And 15.
But if I could just close my thought, so this is the reason why I feel like postmodernism is actually it. The worst parts of postmodernism is not making Batman into a guy who has to have some subjective morality. Yeah. Nor is it in Star Wars or any other piece of art. The problems with postmodernism and the ways that are going to most prevalently exhibit themselves into a negative way, and that's going to impact my children and my children's children, is in the economic sphere, because it has permeated the objective realities. People have said that, all right, truth is relative, and I think that is a byproduct of postmodernism, and that framework is now lending itself to very objective realities like how much money can we print, do genders exist? I mean, very binary things that should be very kind of like black and white, yes or no, value, no value, and it has become this kind of subjectivity added to it, and that has really hurt our ability as a society to deal with real and fundamental problems. And I think that we're going to wake up one day and realize that we're in a world of hurt because we've refused to acknowledge the realities of our world.
In the words of Walter Chopek, we are entering a world of pain.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean that would be sort of the last thing that I would raise is like what you could argue we gain from having a Fed who could manipulate currency and interest rates and everything is this sort of like smoothed out economic situation where as interest rates rise, or rather as interest rates could rise in relationship to, well,
I didn't even mention interest rates.
I know.
For context, again, I'm talking about printing money. We can talk about interest rates as its own other 2-hour discussion.
Yeah.
But like printing money is a fundamental disconnect with reality because at least printing money with the understanding that nothing bad's going to happen as a result is a disconnect between not understanding how the wealth divide happens in America.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to raise the prospect that like there are different ways that wealth inequalities can arise, and if you go back to like say the 20s and the 30s, like you saw these profound disparities, and then you saw these crash effects, and you could say that, oh well, if we're smart about it, we would be able to navigate those dynamics in a way where the Fed could basically manipulate things so that we didn't get these sort of radical crash and boom sort of situations. Now I know that you would say that the Fed creates that,
but because of the Fed.
I would say that our current situation seems to be suggesting that by having the Fed doing what they're doing, they are successfully able to adjust these rates in a way that could create these sorts of soft landings versus like basically the system sort of just has to radically self-correct in a way that puts millions of people out of work and this sort of a thing. Mm-hmm. Now, I know you would disagree with that in theory, but then the idea would be sort of like, if that were true, then I think, I'm just saying, like, given everything you're saying, which I do agree with, then you'd at least have to grapple with, if that were true, is it worth the wealth disparities that even doing that generates based on the sorts of dynamics you're talking about? Basically, like, people are going to say, screw Jeff Bezos, I hate the guy, he's so super rich, he's in, and all the super billionaires of the world, there are these profound wealth inequalities, but a lot of people don't see that to have the supposed smoothing of the economy that the Fed produces, that's a natural consequence of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's its own debate, and we could have that another time, but I just would fundamentally disagree on that point every possible with much gusto, because I think it is very clear that I think that in these complex elements, whenever you involve the Fed, I think people's eyes glaze over. But it's like, it's so complicated, and interest rates. I don't care about any of this money. It's like, so you just default to let smart people figure it out, and I'm sure they know what they're doing. And I just wish that there were more individuals who are willing to kind of look behind the curtain, realize that the person that's driving the show doesn't know what they're doing. And I think that every indication that what's happening in the wealth divide in America and in not just America, but in large parts of the world, every time you have printing money, you have wealth divides take place. And so you can try to blame that on, and not to say that's the one and only issue, but it's like comparing the mountain to the molehill. Exactly. It's like there's maybe little pockets of other things that are causality to that problem, but it doesn't hold a shadow to the major problem. So if we really do care about, putting moving our society forward, it's not by messing with the money supply, and it's not by creating these postmodern relativist viewpoints on reality. It's not. So these are the things that really distort currencies. It distorts our ability to to create value and showcase what put value constructs in place, and it's going to fundamentally create a reckoning that I think is going to be you're right. The Ponzi scheme is going to continue on and on until someone asks their money back, and the shoe is going to stay in the air until it drops. But it's like, do we want to live in a society in which we're constantly hoping for the best, or putting a strong foundation so we can actually move ourselves into the next generation and without crashing and burning, basically?
Well, you heard it here first, audience, and I hope that you feel sufficiently enlightened to feel like you've invested your time wisely and in listening to this conversation. And thank you, Sean. This is I think
Hopefully not too depressing.
No, I don't think so. I think it's very interesting for people to consider the ways that the broader, if you want to consider a postmodern paradigm as being related to a certain set of ideas related to value relativism, and then sort of extending that into the realm of economics and the kinds of domains that are affecting us at a very macro level scale. I don't think that conversation has had enough, so I think that people will gain something from that, whether or not at the very least they have something to look into and to consider whether or not they find these associations convincing, or if or not. But yeah, I appreciate your perspective. So
thank you, Brennan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. And hope you enjoyed this. And we'll catch you on the flip side.
Catch you on the flippity flip.
Adios.
Thanks, Brennan. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah.